So you need to do some heating system maintenance that involves a drain down of your heating system. Well, so many times we hear how difficult and time consuming it is to drain down a heating system, and for that reason so many people avoid it. Well, not after this video, because today I'm going to show you step by step how to drain down and refill your heating system. Now that hose on that drain off that you just saw me put on, we'll come back to that because there's something we need to do first. Step one. Well, the first step is to isolate the heating system. You can see this little switch here. If I turn that off, that turns my boiler off, because the last thing we want is that boiler coming on. If it comes on, it could risk damaging the heating system, so we don't want that happening, and we want a nice cold heating system to do this on. You don't want to do this on a hot heating system. We want nice cold water. So you need to understand a little bit how a pressurized heating system works. Excuse my bad drawing, but quite simply, you've got your boiler and your upstairs radiators and downstairs radiators. If you haven't got an upstairs, ignore that. They'll all be on one level. It works in pretty much the same way. Now, pressurized heating systems are the most common type of heating system here in the UK. These days, you'll often have your boiler and your radiators, and it's a closed system, so you don't need to worry about turning off the water to the property. In most cases, apart from when you're refilling the system, no water can come into the system as we drain it out, so we don't need to worry about that. Now, when we do want water to come in, I'll show you that at the end of the job, what we'll have is a little filling loop that comes into the bottom of the boiler, and that is what we'll use to fill up the heating system again at the end, but we'll come back to that. Now, there is another common heating type, a gravity fed type, that has tanks in the loft. That's how you know if you're not on a system like this, you'll have tanks in the loft. So let's say that's your loft space there. You'll have a couple of tanks, normally a big one and a small one, so you've got a little header tank. Now, if you are on a gravity fed system and you want to do some heating maintenance, my advice would be to pull a vacuum. So I have some detail on that on a video I'll put in the description where I change a TRV on a radiator. I show you how to pull a vacuum on a gravity fed heating system using bungs. But this being a pressurized system, we don't need to worry about all that stuff. Our heating system's isolated, so we know that we can work on it without any interference from any incoming water. So as we come back to this, our drain valve, what we need to think about is where are we going to find one of these? How do we go about draining down the system? Well, this is a drain valve. If I take this hose off here for now, and on your average 2-bedroom house, that is a floor, by the way, you're probably going to find it somewhere on the edge of one of your downstairs radiators. You can attach a hose on that and you can run it outside. So have a look around downstairs and you'll commonly find it's been installed near a back door, near a patio door, or near a door of some sort. So let's assume you've located that now. Let's have a look at how we begin to drain the water from the heating system. So assuming you want to drain down your whole heating system, including your radiators, you want to open up all the valves on each radiator. Any radiator that has its valves closed will retain the water. And that's my little top trick that we'll come back to shortly with regards to shortening and making this process easier, especially on a big house with 12 radiators like this one. Now, occasionally you get a strange layout. You might have a radiator in an extension or something like that, and that might have 2 pipes coming into it. Okay, let's assume it's got 2 pipes coming into it like that. Now that is called a leg. Now usually with a leg you'll find that you'll have those 2 pipes coming from the ceiling or something like that, and they're just feeding that radiator. They go in and they go back out in the same direction. If that's the case, that radiator can't be drained with the rest of the system and that water's trapped in there. If you just think of it like a little loop, it's actually trapped, because when we drain the heating system it drains from the top with gravity. We can't always drain that leg, so it will often have its own drain off. So if you'll know if it's a leg really, because it'll have its own drain off. Well, it should do. But bear in mind, you don't always need to drain a leg unless you're working on that part of the system. So we'll come back to that shortly. Now we know where our drain off valve is. We need a length of hose, an off-cutter hose that's long enough to reach outdoors. We're then going to push that on the end of our drain off. Now sometimes, depending on the drain valve, you'll get a little leak from around the top of the pipe when you let the water out. The Jubilee clip being tightened up on there can just prevent that. It doesn't always need to happen, but sometimes you will get leaks without one. Now I'm just going to chuck the other end of the hose pipe outside. Bear in mind that if you are doing it on a patio like that, you probably want to rinse the patio down afterwards, because the water that comes out of your heating system can be black and horrible. If you've got a hose pipe long enough, try and do it on the grass. And we're now going to let some water out, but before I do that, make sure you subscribe, because you don't want to miss out on more videos like this. We do these types of videos all the time. And hit like for me, because that helps this video reach and help more people. Now we'll just pop our adjustable spanner on there and open up the drain valve. And once that's open, you can hear that water rushing out. So the water is rushing out the other end of that hose pipe. The heating system is draining down, but what's going to happen in a minute or so is that water is going to slow down again way before it should do. And that is because it's pulling a vacuum. So as that water, via gravity, drains out of the system from the top down, no air is able to get into the system from the highest point to replace it, and it begins to pull a vacuum, and you'll see it slow down at the other end of the hose. So let's head upstairs to the highest point and let a little bit of air in, and that'll keep that water flowing. Now, to speed things up again, to get all that water out and get rid of that vacuum, you'll want one of these, a radiator bleed key. Links to the tools you need for this job will be in the description, along with all the other videos to help you through step by step. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to let that air back in. Now we'll need to come to the highest point in the property. On this property, it's this towel radiator upstairs. Now occasionally in some properties, in a loft or somewhere like that, you might have a bleed valve. I'll pop a little picture here. That usually happens if you've got those legs that we talked about that maybe go up into a loft and then down into another room. Because you get that area that can't be bled, there's a little valve sometimes in the loft. So just have a look around, because this might not always be the case, and this video is about being thorough. So that's not the case in this property. This is the highest point. So we're going to let some air in, and we're going to hear that suction, we're going to hear that vacuum come out as we do it. Can you hear that? That is the suction, that is the weight of that water coming out of the system, and that hose now, that's going to speed up again until all of the water exits your heating system. Now back to the drawing board, one little watch out as that water drains down. If you've got pipes underneath the floor in concrete or in floorboards, those pipes being lower than our drain off here, well, they're not going to drain. So if you want to do some work on your pipe work underneath the floor and you need to cut into it, you're still going to get water come out. Now my top tip for that is to use a wet vac. I have a wet vac handy, and I just suck out the water from the pipes with a wet vac. That is the easiest way to do it. Now this week on Ultimate Tool Competitions, we're giving away wet vacs. We've got the choice of a Makita, a DeWalt or a Milwaukee for the winner. It's only 45 tickets, so 1 in 45. If you buy one ticket, you're going to get yourself a wet vac, and you can use that on a whole host of jobs. So make sure you're heading over to Ultimate Tool Competitions, where we give away tools every single week, low ticket prices, low odds. I'll see you over there. Now back to the video. So what we need to do is suck out any of that existing water with a wet vac. That's the easiest way to do it. Now watch out, number 2, and something for you to think about, the most common thing that catches people out, and that is, do we need to drain out the whole heating system? For example, if you're only working on the valves for this radiator here, or you're taking off that radiator or whatever, we can just isolate the other radiators. To isolate a standard radiator, we just turn off the TRV, thermostatic radiator valve, close that all the way, and at the other end you'll probably have a lock shield. This one looks like it's leaked at some point. And now on a lock shield, we'll close that pin clockwise, righty-tighty, with a pair of grips or an adjustable. Count the amount of turns that you do, because that'll be important to balance the system later. Again, there's a video in the description of how you do that. Now that is a whole lot of water, a whole lot of volume of water that we could save. We don't have to refill that, we don't have to drain that. Of course, in that situation, all we're doing is we're draining the pipework above the point at which we're working, and that's a lot less water. So going back to what I said at the beginning, where I said open up all the valves, that's only if you want to drain the whole system, if you're taking off your radiators, doing extensive works, or draining it out to flush it, something like that. Otherwise, you just don't need to empty out the whole system. So if we look outside, our hose has stopped running. So you can be confident your heating system's drained down. You can get on, change that radiator valve, change that pipe work around, whatever it is you want to do on your heating system. But we're not done yet, because now we've drained it down, we've done all our work, we need to refill this thing. So now what I want you to do is close everything off, including the drain off valve and the bleed valves at the highest point. So everything's shut. We've got a closed off system again for now. We are going to open some stuff later, but for now, everything is shut back off. Our hose pipe can now come off. Now everything's closed off, we can start that refilling process. And the first part of that is to add some of this stuff, inhibitor. This stuff's important to add and it prevents corrosion and limescale in the system. Now, I've got a video on the channel that's done nearly 600,000 views that details adding this stuff in the system. So I'm not going to run through it in detail in this video. There'll be videos down below in the description that support this video throughout the steps, and I'll list them all in order. So in the description you'll find the video where you can then reference, when you've finished watching this one, how to add this. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to add this and then we'll come back and start adding some water. So we're back at the boiler, the same place we started, and now we can turn that on again. Now the boiler's back on, but you're probably going to find something similar to that message just there. System pressure too low. Now this is a fancy digital boiler. A lot of them will just have a gauge where it'll have red and green, and what you're looking for is your pressure to be at 1 bar. It's going to be, of course, at 0 at this point. So we're going to come back to where we started with that little fill-in loop that I explained to you on the diagram that fills up the heating system. This boiler has a panel on the bottom that comes off, and the fill-in loop on your boiler will be underneath. If we look under the boiler, that is the filling loop with that little blue handle on it there. So all we need to do, if we pull that, we'll hear water rushing into the system, and that is what's going to repressurize our system. You can see our boiler says that we need to refill it to 1 bar, and 1 bar is the most common pressure that you'll want to fill your heating system to. Of course, this is a fancy digital boiler. A lot of them have got that old school gauge, and you'll see they go green at 1 bar. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to fill it up to 1 bar. Now the length of time it takes to fill up your system will of course vary dependent on the radiators that you had open at the time, the amount of water that you released, the size of the heating system, and so on and so forth. But that pressure will start to rise. Now this fancy Worcester Bosch that was installed by a company called iHeat, that will kick in once it reaches the correct pressure. Until then, the boiler simply won't do anything. And there we go. We're now at that 1 bar, and the boiler, quickly if I get this, is now saying system pressure okay, and the boiler has kicked in. Speaking of boilers, if you're in need of a new one, check out iHeat. You can get a stress-free fixed price quote on your phone within minutes. They're a national company and they're really, really good. They installed this boiler here. In fact, you can see it on the front on the screen there. So make sure you give them a look if you need a new boiler. The link will be down below in the description. Repressurization and filling of the heating system and bleeding the heating system, they go hand in hand. You can't do one without the other. So that is where we now come up to the highest points in the system and go around the radiators, and we bleed the system. So if I open this radiator, now we've got pressure back in the system. You can hear that? That is air coming up to the highest point, being pushed out by that pressure. Now, I'll come back to that. As I do that, the pressure on the boiler is going to drop again. And depending on how much water we're putting back in versus air, that will vary as to how many times we need to repressurize that boiler. So you'll find you'll be back and forth, bleeding and pressurizing as you go. Now I've got a complete guide on that as well, of course, and that is in the description as well. So I'm not going to go through this in too much depth. Check out that video. Check them all out in the process that you need them to get this job done. Now, as you leave me doing the fun part, bleeding the radiators, recommissioning this heating system, I hope it's helped and made it easy for you. And if it has, don't forget there's so much more to learn. I'll see you in the next one.